Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome to our panel today called Story Shift in the South. My name is Natalie Bullock Brown, and I will be the moderator for today's conversation. My pronouns are she, her, hers. For those of you who are visually impaired, I'm a Black woman wearing eyeglasses with bob-length locks and a gray sweatshirt dress. And I am coming to you from Raleigh, North Carolina, which is the land of the Tuscarora and Catawba people. Before we launch into the conversation with this incredible panel of women, I want to share a little bit about Working Films and Story Shift, which is an initiative of Working Films. So for those of you who don't know, Working Films is a nonprofit organization that's been based in Wilmington, North Carolina for the last 21 years. And Working Films' mission is to use documentary films to advance social justice and environmental protection. Again, Story Shift is an initiative of Working Films. And what we are doing is seeking to shift and promote accountable and ethical storytelling. So this panel is going to delve into what accountable and ethical storytelling means, in particular when we talk about stories coming from the South. I'm gonna introduce this panel of beautiful people, women, filmmakers, organizers, who are with me today. Each of you, actually, I'm gonna have you introduce yourself. Let me back that up. Please introduce yourself. I'm gonna popcorn it across the screen according to how I see you. And when you introduce yourself, please give your name, the project you're working on, or your organization, your pronouns, a descriptor, and land acknowledgement. And finally, give us a little taste of what you're grateful for that's giving you joy these days. I'll start with April.
Okay, well, my name is April Dobbins, and my project is called Alabama Land. It's a feature documentary. My pronouns are she, hers, and I am a Black woman with an afro wearing a V-neck t-shirt. Right now I'm based in Miami, Florida, which is Seminole Miccosukee land. And something that I'm grateful for, or that's bringing me joy. My COVID-19 test was negative, so that's fantastic, you know?
Yes.
And are you gonna popcorn it?
And your land acknowledgement.
Oh, Seminole Miccosukee.
Awesome, thank you, April. Molly.
Hi, everyone. I am Molly Murphy. My pronouns are she, her. I am a white woman with long, dark brown hair, and I have on a red blouse. I am co-director of Working Films, so I have the privilege of working with Natalie Bullock Brown, and I am traveling. So both what is bringing me joy and what leaves me with a question mark is the land acknowledgement for where I am. I know that I'm north of Wilmington, North Carolina, where I'm based, which the history there has been so erased that it's not known what the original tribe and territory is. I believe this is Waccamaw territory that lies north above us, but without a doubt, I am on occupied indigenous land.
Thank you so much, Molly. And last but not least, Lana.
Hi, my name is Lana Garland. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I come today from Durham, North Carolina, which is on Tuscarora and Shakora land, also the Shakori, and the Eno and Occaneechi band of the Saponi tribes. I am a Black woman. I'm sitting in my living room, Black woman with short gray afro hair and a mustard yellow top and Black glasses. My project is The Passing On, which is about the waning existence of the Black funeral home in America. And I'm also huge fans of each and every one of these women that's on the Zoom today.
Thank you so much, all of you. We're going to get to our conversation with this incredible panel, and you're going to hear me keep referring to them as incredible because they are. But I want to give you a little context for our conversation today. So Working Films and StoryShift have been thinking about accountability and ethical storytelling for, I would say, 3 years. I came to the work with Working Films a couple of years ago, and I had the opportunity to direct a series of videos that feature filmmakers who are really trying to incorporate accountability practices into their filmmaking work. I want to show you a clip, or actually a trailer, of the work that we did initially with StoryShift, which features all of the filmmakers, just so that you know. There are videos featuring each set of filmmakers on the StoryShift website, and we'll give you that information at the end of the panel. But right now, would love to show you the trailer.
When we're telling stories about another community, there are questions we need to ask ourselves. We need to challenge ourselves and ask questions about representation.
I think there's a lot of filmmakers, especially white filmmakers, probably especially white male filmmakers. There's this attitude like, I know all this stuff. Like, you have to recognize what you don't know.
There's the potential in the practice to be completely collaborative or completely predatory.
It's as if Black people and people of color show up in certain films for the first time ever on the planet when they've been encountered by the filmmaker.
We're constantly looking for ways to grow equity and inclusion and dismantle misogyny and dismantle white supremacy and dismantle socioeconomic privilege as it shows up in our creative relationships.
They have to really reflect upon their own issues of power, their own relationship to power. You being honest and telling your story is something that is important. People need to know just how you feel. They're not going to know how to help you if you don't be honest and straightforward with them.
All right, so that was just a taste of the work that Working Films and StoryShift have been doing together. And hopefully that gives you a little bit of a sense of the types of questions that we are trying to answer as we think through what it means to be accountable, ethical filmmakers. I'd like to run through a set of values that StoryShift has developed in conjunction with a working group that Molly and I have had the pleasure and honor to work with. It's a group of people who come from various sectors of the documentary field. And we've been working on a framework for, I would say, the past 3 to 6 months that has emerged as something that we feel we can begin to sort of build out that right now focuses on values for filmmakers. But because we recognize that there are other gatekeepers, well, there are gatekeepers and other stakeholders in the documentary field, we're looking forward to doing more work to build out what it means for funders to be accountable, what it means for distributors to be accountable, film festivals, and so forth. But right now, these core values that I'm going to share with you are really for filmmakers. So the first value is strive for accuracy. And that simply means that not only should you be concerned about the facts and getting those correct, but when you're telling a story, especially a story that is not necessarily your own, where you're representing a community or a person that is not from your lived experience. There is an accuracy of representation that's necessary. So we're trying to encourage filmmakers to think about, what do I need to do, or what do I need to know that I don't already know, in order to be as accurate as possible in my representation. Secondly, we are encouraging filmmakers to integrate anti-racist practices into their work. And really what we have found as we've talked about this in the working group is that we're talking about an introspection that has to take place on the part of filmmakers before they even begin to tackle a story or decide that they're going to tell a story. That means, am I the right person to tell this story? Have I done the work that will help me to, again, represent the community, the people that I am trying to tell a story about? And if I haven't done that work, am I really the right person to tell the story? And of course, when we talk about the work, we're talking about anti-racist work. Number 3, be transparent in your relationships. A lot of times, and I'll say traditionally, filmmakers have not necessarily felt like they needed to share information about the filmmaking process with their protagonists, or even with their funders, or their audience. What we are encouraging is that there's a way that filmmakers need to think about the filmmaking process in relationship with their protagonists, that the best filmmaking comes from collaboration between communities and filmmakers. And that really leads me to the next question, or value rather, which is acknowledge your power. Oftentimes we think about power as someone who has power to control our destiny, right? A president, a head of a company, but filmmakers have a power no matter what race or background they come from, just because they have a camera. And so we have to think about, how are we wielding the power that we have as filmmakers? And is there a way that we can mitigate the power dynamics that often exist, especially between BIPOC communities and white filmmakers? But understand that that power can exist between any filmmaker. It depends on how we think about what we do with the camera and the extent to which we're going to control the narratives that we take on. 5, respect the dignity and the agency of the people in your film. This value is really promoting the idea that when you leave a community, when you're done telling the story of that community, that you leave them intact, that you leave their dignity and their agency intact, that you do no harm, that you have not extracted from that community in ways that leaves it deficient because of your presence. And that does also relate to acknowledging your power and understanding what a filmmaker's presence does in certain communities. And finally, treat your audience with dignity and respect their intelligence. One of the things that we've talked about quite a bit in our working group is the fact that sometimes films that are meant to celebrate a certain community can actually be very traumatizing and trigger that community in ways that are not intended. And so we have to be mindful of, really who our audience is, and make sure that we are indeed honoring and celebrating and lifting up that community in the ways that we intend, and that, again, we're not doing any harm. So that's a quick run through of these values. They're a part of a larger framework, as I said, and we're gonna give you an opportunity, if you'd like to see that framework in its entirety. You'll have an opportunity to, we'll share with you a link to the framework or to get in touch with the working group that I've been referencing so that we can send you the framework and we can invite you to be a part of the tweaking and refining of that framework if that is something that you'd be interested in. Okay, so enough of my voice. I want to bring in our panelists and have this conversation. So what I'm going to ask is that each of our panelists give opening thoughts about accountability, especially in relationship to the core values that I just shared. So I'm gonna call on our panelists, and this time I'm gonna start with Lana.
Thank you for that, Natalie. The core values are very, very, very strong. And, you know, in the work that I've done on this latest project, you know, we had to take on many of what's mentioned there head on. I'm the producer of The Passing On, a documentary that's being screened at this year's New Orleans Film Festival. And it is a multiracial team. And so we've had to have a lot of conversations around accountability and who gets to tell the story, because early on, it was kind of obvious. Well, let me give a little bit of background for this particular project. It started out as a survey film about the process of death. So my friend and colleague, Nate Clark, was doing this film called We All Die. I was the program director at the Southern Documentary Fund. And in the process of doing this survey film about all cultures in America and a lot of death traditions, he came across this community in San Antonio, Texas. And so when he kind of changed gears and said, wow, I've got to tell this story, he brought it back to us. And we, of course, because the policy at the Southern Documentary Fund had been one in which whatever community you're speaking of, there needs to be representation, not just somewhere, but specifically in the leadership. So in the projects that the Southern Documentary Fund takes on, there has to be representation either in the director or the producer seat. And so they didn't have that at that time. And so not shortly after that, I left Southern Documentary Fund and they asked me to come on as a producer. And so thus started a series of conversations in which, you know, it felt like, okay, so now I have to kind of teach. That's what I was thinking. And of course, there was a lot of information that we were sharing. And there were moments where, you know, Nate would ask, well, I'm trying to make a film that will, it's rooted in the Black community, but it will touch everybody. So do I need to put X, Y, and Z in there? And I said, your thinking about it is wrong. The thinking in order to reach the communities that you're trying to reach is that you do a deep dive into what is the African American community, because that's where it's situated. And you honor that community and you honor the audience that is intimately tied to that community. So that was kind of the first big shift around the way Nate kind of thought about the film. And we had conversations about how there's a couple of things. I always say that one, art is specific. In order to get to kind of the humanity of a piece, you have to be specific. And it's difficult to be specific if you're not from that community. And so that was kind of the first part of many conversations that we had about our ethical approach to the work. Another thing that I think that Nate would say was a big aha moment for him, when I was brought into the community, he noticed how there was still a difference between how our main participant reacted to him versus the way he reacted to me. So what is kind of glossed over, a lot of times we talk in terms of black and white, but oftentimes we also need to include a wider discussion around gender, a wider discussion around where you live in the country. If you are regionally based in New York, can you tell a proper story in the South? So that is another thing that kind of goes by the wayside oftentimes in this conversation around accountability and extractive storytelling. So we have many examples of that, but I'll just pass the baton and listen to what other folks have to say.
No, that was a great setup for this conversation, because of course we are situating our conversation in the South, and that piece of the pie, as it were, that you just mentioned, which is a regional consideration, which we don't always think about, is very important and is of course central to what we will discuss. Okay, Molly, if you would.
Yeah. So, you know, as you mentioned, Working Films has been around for 21 years, and we've been based in the South, on the coast of North Carolina, and much of our work is rooted in the South. And, you know, what we do is bring the world of documentary filmmaking and social justice together. And, you know, use the power of film to really engage and involve audiences in actions that they can take that are meaningful and accessible to them to address issues that impact their life, or their lives and their communities. And in that work, we've always, you know, reflected on and focused on being accountable to our partners and to the residents where we're working. But it's only more recently that we've had the realization that that should also play into the selection of films with which we choose to work and support. And the way that happened was when we begin our campaigns, we bring together partner organizations and change leaders and people who are directly impacted to inform the direction and to, you know, set the direction for their participation in partnership with us. And we were in 2017 working on Just Transition, which is the work of this really easy work of making the world less toxic and racist and equitable in our economy. But what was brought up is that you can't address the exploitation of people on the planet using films unless you address the long-standing practices of documentary filmmaking that are exploitive and extractive and harmful in those places. And many of our partners have had the experiences at times of crisis of filmmakers parachuting in, telling their stories with no connection to it, not reflecting the authentic narrative, actually oftentimes putting forward harmful narratives, and then not even having access to the films once they're out. And that was the turning point for us, where we realized we have to make an organizational change where we take this into account in a much deeper way than we ever have before around what films we choose to work with. And we need a whole new level of analysis in doing that. And everyone else in the documentary field needs to do this too. And we're going to work on trying to make that happen. And that's really, you know, where STORYSHIFT came from as an organizational program and initiative. And then these practices of accountability internally and in the choices that we're making have evolved from that point. And I know we're probably going to go into more detail, so I won't take up more space here about the ways in which that has happened, but I'm excited to share it while we go through this conversation.
Thank you so much, Molly. Yes, we will definitely give you an opportunity to talk about the ways that Working Films has shifted some of its practices, because it's very important modeling for the rest of the field. April.
Hello. So there's so much good stuff that I wanted to touch on that both Lana and Molly addressed, but I think for me, so I've been doing a lot of reading, and I've been reading this book by Alison Graham called Framing the South. where she describes the South as this celluloid institution that's been mapped by a century of fabulous. And Hollywood has sort of been eager to come in and like stake a claim in that institution. I've been reading a lot about like the privilege of perception and just, so as some background, I live in Miami right now, but I'm originally from Hale County, Alabama. And my documentary is set and centered in Hale County, Alabama, where all my family lives. That county has sort of been a place that's more defined by documentarians than the people who actually live there. And that started, you know, like it started a very long time ago, like during the civil rights era. Like there were a lot of reporters coming in and out who were on the beat, sort of defining what the South was and really rooted in the stereotypes that already existed. But a lot of people know James Agee and Walker Evans did the book, Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, which was like photography. And that sort of reinforced the stereotype of this poor place at the edge of the world. And ever since that book has come out, like in the decades that have followed, people sort of revisit that my county to follow in these footsteps and to sort of like reiterate this narrative of what this place is. So for me as a filmmaker coming from there and like doing this documentary that's very much about my family and very close to my heart, I think a lot of people who are operating just as funders, as industry people, don't sort of know the history of place and the struggle to counter those narratives and like what a burden that is, right? I think a lot of times, Matthew says something in his book about movies being cited as a reflection of social trends rather than like active participants in the political arena. And so for me, I think me coming to film, I think of myself as an active participant in that political arena. And this film that I'm putting out into the world is not just a reflection of my family and the place. And I think people coming from a more privileged perspective see it as just a mere reflection, right? So it's difficult to argue with people who don't have that background information and to sort of like advocate for myself when people don't understand where I'm coming from as a filmmaker in this place, and also the responsibilities that come with that. I'm sort of like fighting decades of like negative stereotypes, negative imagery. And one thing Lana said was like that we need to sort of like focus on gender. And I think that class is also a huge part of that, because there's a certain privilege that comes with sort of saying you should be able to do this in this way in this amount of time. And maybe someone who is working on a film or doing a film who's not from a place of privilege can't do that. So yeah, those are my 2 cents.
I mean, this has been such a, y'all have set it off. I'm just gonna put it that way, because the things that you have brought up, you know, are so important for us to consider when it comes to accountability. But again, specifically in terms of Southern documentary filmmaking, what you're raising, you know, is a conversation that I don't think we often get to have. So let's keep this going, just especially given what April just said. You know, I think I'm gonna pull something that I was gonna ask you later, April, into this conversation. Now we'll go back the other way in terms of the order of the panelists. But can you talk about this idea of time and being rushed as a Southern filmmaker, but also the idea of time, you know, almost as a stereotype when we think about the South and what we don't understand about I guess the time as a character, really, when we're thinking about Southern filmmaking.
Yeah, so I think I'm very honest about the fact that I've had so many struggles in the process, the making of my film. And most of those struggles have had to do with sort of like the countering of stereotypes, like it's almost like there's a double burden, right? Like I know that I'm a filmmaker and I have an obligation to finish this product that I've started. But at the same time, like if we're talking about time, the stereotype of Southerners is that everything moves slowly, right? That it's like glacial pace. We can't get anything done. It's all molasses. And of course, like I'm speaking broadly, but we know the South is not a monolith. Like Southerners are all very different. But that is the stereotype that I'm battling coming into the ring as a filmmaker. I think for me personally, my family is very thoughtful and careful. And I think myself, like as a storyteller, I'm very thoughtful and careful. I'd rather get it right than mess it all up. Like I feel like the stakes are really high. So for me, coming into the industry, not really knowing much, immediately, like I think I was still in development, really early production, and people were asking me, you know, months in, where's your film? You know, where's your film? Where's your film? Where's your film? So it sort of put this pressure on me and made me feel like, oh, well, documentaries should take a year, you know, or documentaries should take a year and a half, 2 years. So therefore I'm failing. I'm being the stereotypical Southerner. I'm not moving fast enough. I'm not delivering things fast enough. Where in actuality, it's a very complicated story that I'm trying to tell. And in order to get people to trust me, and these are people that I already know, I have to take my time. Like I have to be more careful. The onus is sort of like on me to tell the story of my entire family from slavery until now, right? And so for me, it just sort of like I shut down because I don't operate well in spaces where I feel like I'm being clamored at and I feel like I'm a commodity. So for me, there was this feeling of, okay, I'm now sort of like the exceptional poster child for Black Southern filmmakers. And that's a huge burden to carry as a human being, being the human being that I am. But then also trying to carry that burden and forge ahead and finish a product was crippling for me. And I don't come from a place of privilege. So having people say things like, well, if you just quit your job, you could finish your movie was so, I can't even tell you how offensive that is to me. Like with the way that my life works. I'm a single parent, I work full time. I have like 5 part-time jobs. So to have people in my ear saying things like that really made me feel like I'm failing in some way. And I think for me, it's super important, and I'm gonna like finish up here. It's super important for us too, as Southern filmmakers, to be honest about the struggles that we have with industry. And I think because there are other filmmakers behind us who are having the same struggles. And I think it's hard to do that when you think that might jeopardize your relationships or your funding. Yeah. But if we talk to each other, like I thought I was struggling in this alone by myself and that I was failing, right? So if we don't talk to one another honestly about these things, and if we don't talk to our industry, like relations and people and funders honestly about these things, we're not going to get anywhere.
April, I really appreciate your honesty in that. And Molly, if you wouldn't mind, I want to go to Lana now, because I know that you have some thoughts about what April just said. And I also want to move into a clip from the passing on the back end of what you want to say right now. And I'm going to get to you, Molly.
Yes, it was so much there. You know, as we were talking on our pre-call and we talked about a tale of 3 projects, I'll call it, you know, my earlier project, Washerwoman, your Bartman and Beyonce project, and then April's project, and how April was telling us that she became the darling and the Southern maker, while, you know, you and I have really struggled to get support for our projects. And so, you know, I thought about that thing that, and it's something that comes from white supremacy around the chosen one, and even worse off, the chosen Negro, and how that pits us against each other. We're competing for these resources which of course that's going to happen. But um, when you're thinking about the way in which this industry is set up, it seems as if there are far fewer slots for us. And so it brings to mind a couple of questions. What are we going to do? You know, one of the things that I wanted to do, and I did while I was at the Southern Documentary Fund, was this Doc Fubu. And you are one of the participants, Natalie, in Doc Fubu, Doc for Us by Us, whereby it was how or what are the ways in which we can, from the Black community, source our own projects instead of kind of having to go to Caesar every time to get funding, to get distribution, because we all know, you know, you render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. And sometimes it doesn't fit our community. Oftentimes it doesn't match our community. So we do this thing of shape shifting, trying to fit within the mold, and that is going to affect the project. So I feel that way. And one of the reasons why I left the Southern Documentary Fund was to go to Haiti so that I could have a platform. And what I mean by that, the Haiti Heritage Film Festival occurs every year in Durham, North Carolina. I'm the festival director. And I see how, you know, both from the filmmaker perception of Haiti, how oftentimes we as Black people will also use the rules and regulations of Caesar to analyze each other. Oftentimes, people will pull projects away from Haiti because there's another general market festival that has said, you're enough. And so that's one thing I'm noticing. There's also on the acquisition side, this weird thing that happens. There was a film I was trying to acquire. I had been on the jury that gave this particular film project its initial grant. And so years later, it's been in the world. I go to the maker and I say, well, I would like to screen it for an event at Haiti. Series of conversations, because now it's being shown on a particular network, and so the network is doing a lot to interrogate me about who I am and whether or not we're worthy enough to show their film. And so there are kind of different manifestations of this thing that happens. And you know, where I am right now in my life and in my career, you know, most of my career has been in New York and in Europe. And the reason why I left it is because I know I do my best work when I'm with my people. So I kind of intentionally kind of came out of that and came to the South. But a part of it that we kind of, I feel as though it's a big part of what we have to do in order to combat some of these things, is that one, we have to hip hopify documentary film. We have to find the street lamp and the turntable and plug it together in a Southern kind of way to be able to kind of build the type of industry that we need in our community. That's number one. Number two is that this conversation is moot if the gatekeepers are not talking about how they're going to share power. You know, we are shape-shifting, creating these diversity programs that don't work. They don't work because there's no buy-in. There's nothing for the gatekeepers who are creating them to lose. There's nothing there or to share. So that's the second part of this. It's not going to work if we're not sharing resources.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know what? I'm gonna renege on what I said, and because I want to get Molly's reaction to this as an organization that's based in the South, as an organization that's thinking about a lot of what April and Lana just shared. I mean, you know, what has Working Films done to combat some of this? And I'm really interested to hear, I mean, we can talk about it towards the end of this conversation, but I think now is a good time to hear, what would you recommend to other gatekeepers in the doc field in response to what April and Lana have described?
Yeah. So also plus to what both April and Lana shared. And as a national nonprofit who's based in the South, like there's no question that we've benefited from having historically white leadership. And one thing that we have always had to do is to travel outside of our region to garner resources. Traveling only to like build relationship with supporters outside our region is how we've been able to sustain. And I notice, the amount of resources that still go to arts organizations, like kind of that fall in the kind of work that we do, that are based in New York or LA or in another place, that come to serve us, to come to because our region needs them, when we have incredible organizations based in the South. The New Orleans Film Festival and New Orleans Film Society is one of them. South Arts, Apple Shop, we're here. There's, that's just something that I take note of, and that we have. It's absolutely critical and necessary that we've had to raise funds just to be able to travel, to make ourselves seem relevant outside of our region. And I noticed, we can become a novelty where these initiatives come to our region, drop in, they might hold a gathering, and then, we're not really in touch anymore. It's so that's something I take note of. And then for us, if you're asking about kind of how we have started, both in the decisions that we're making about films that we'll take on and tour, which there aren't a ton of organizations doing that. So there's power in that. The selections we make for what to work with and what to tour. And then in 2017, we became a grant maker because we received support from MacArthur Foundation for the first time to be able to fund short films that are used in our organizing campaigns. And so that happened at that same turning point where we were taking accountability into account. And so the way that we started was including questions within submission applications and RFP that are asking, why are you the one to tell this story? What is your connection to the issues that your film raises? How are you demonstrating accountability to the people whom you're filming and the communities that you're representing? And we asked for letters of support also for people being filmed and organizations or organizers working on those issues to really vouch and to say that this is being done in a way that will serve us and be beneficial. And that is one thing that we're one of a few entities that have began to include those questions. I know Firelight is including those questions, and there are a few, but too few are even asking that question. No matter how it weighs into the decisions that they make, they aren't asking that question. But it's a step further, and in our conversation in advance of this, we talked about even with those criteria and it being something that you take into account, there is power in who is making the decision. And if you do not have the actual decision makers of where resources are going, include or be completely made up of people who are directly impacted, that's a problem. And so there's only so far you can go in terms of a real shift toward accountability without evolving further toward that step. And that's what we've done. We've just announced a call for, we'll both be funding and curating and touring films on abolition, with the intention of increasing understanding of what abolition is and envisioning a world without police and prisons. And in doing that, we've worked with our partners who are the Center for Political Education, Critical Resistance, MPD 150, Survived and Punished. And Working Films is using what we have in terms of supporting them in putting together a call for media, developing an RFP, determining what we want these, what they want these films to include. But we've also decided to take ourselves out of the decision making, and our partners will be serving as the decision makers of who's receiving the funds. We're there to offer guidance and support, but I think that's a key evolution. And I anticipate that we'll evolve even further as we dig deeper and really examine how aligned we are with our values of accountability and truly making sure that power is coming from the ground up and led by those who are directly impacted.
I'd like to add something to this because I think it's really important. And I think for Molly, it's probably a really little thing and she really doesn't think much about it. And for me, in my world, it's huge. Working films is always checking for me. You know how we say that in the Black community? It's like, I need somebody who knows that I exist because my time is so little. I have no bandwidth to do all that I have to do within the day. And if you're talking about something, an endeavor like putting on a film festival while being a maker, I don't have time. I don't have resources. I don't have. So I'm running. And so there are people who are existing like this in the world, yet you have organizations or people like Working Film who are checking for me. So I'll get the call. Hey, Lana, what's it looking like for Haiti? What are y'all thinking about? The last festival earlier this year, it's February of every year. So in February, I got the call. It was like, Lana, do you want us to do a speed dating session with folks so that, people can come by and, talk to us about how to get their doc project made. This coming year, they called and said, listen, what about a work in progress program? We can get a couple of film projects. We can screen them. We can get some industry experts and we can kind of advance and push forward the notion of these projects getting done. So that is so important to me because if I didn't have Working Films, I'd have to just build every piece of that particular program on my own, and I just don't have the time. So I'd like to acknowledge it, not to just big up Molly. I love her and we work well together. That's my girl. But to use it as a blueprint for other organizations. Check on your people. Check on the BIPOC organizations that don't have a pot to piss in and they need some resources. So just wanted to mention that.
Thank you so much, Lana. I appreciate both the response to what Molly shared, but Molly, thank you also for the work that Working Films is doing and for being a leader in shifting power and sharing power, because you're not only talking the talk, but walking it. And hopefully there will be more organizations, gatekeepers, who see what Working Films is doing and decide they're going to do something similar. We are quickly running out of time, so I don't want to go any further without showing a couple of short clips from Lana's film, The Passing On. I'm going to ask her to talk about those on the other side of the clips. And then April, I have a question for you that I think will work well after these clips. So we'll see The Passing On.
Okay, I'll have Tony take it and send it to you. Yeah, right now I just have a blue one. Okay.
I'm still available at my cell phone, but I'll be at a funeral service perhaps for the next hour and a half.
The funeral home has been in the community for years and years and years, and it's very well known.
Okay, so you just saw a few clips from The Passing On, which is a film that Lana Garland produced. And Lana, you know, in our prep convo for today, you talked a little bit about how at least one of these clips demonstrated to you in, I guess, part of the screening of the film. It told you something about how Black people are regarded, and you had some very insights about that. Please share. You're muted, hon.
Sorry about that. I thought it was important to show those because, let's see, in one scene, you saw the receptionist who has extremely long nails putting names up on the board in terms of, you know, it was a board that showed who was being buried that particular day. Then the second clip was the beginnings of a funeral whereby the family decided to wear red. And I wanted to show that because I think it's instructful to kind of have a conversation about voyeurism. And what I mean by that is that, you know, at some point we went to, you know, some really dope ass consultants and showed them the film, and we just wanted feedback, you know, professional feedback went really, really high. I mean, these were incredible people, and they continue to be. And some of the feedback we got back, it was of the nature of wanting to know things about the Black community that they wanted explained. So these were two of the clips that a lot of people talked about. There was a question about, you know, is there something in the Black community about wearing red to the funeral? And the other was, well, what about the nails? You know, that, you know, her nails, don't you want to say something about her nails? And so it became apparent to Nate and I that it was a very kind of voyeuristic approach to the African American community. And so in thinking about that, you know, I really had to think, why was that such a huge thing for me? And I think it's because, and I'm going to put it in these terms, it was the documentary equivalent of, can I touch your hair? Can I touch your hair, Black person? Can you lean in so that I can pet you and touch your hair? It's sort of like that. It feels that way. And so we decided as an approach, that, and the editor, producer, Tyler Trumbo does such a good job of spotting this, and we decided that if there were questions that we would get, or feedback that we would get that was of a voyeuristic nature, and it wasn't something that would kind of sit well or be native within the African American community, we threw it out. We threw it out. We don't need to deal with that. It's not a question that's based on the humanity of the film. It's a question that's based on your voyeuristic need and kind of this unconscious, and these are great people. So they're not evil. It's just this unconscious othering of people that happens. And so this is just an example of one way you have to kind of have these kinds of conversations in telling stories about particular communities.
Thank you so much for that, because it's making me think about April, your film, Alabama Land, which I haven't seen, but hearing you talk about it, knowing that you and your family are in it, I'm wondering, you know, what kinds of parallels there may be. What kinds of considerations are you having to think about that are similar to what Lana just described, or just in general, in terms of, you know, thinking about how you're representing your family and yourself?
Yeah, I mean, it's super complicated, right? Like, it is a battle on a battle on a battle. Like, that's how I feel. And I think a lot of the things that Lana said about the sort of like, can I touch your hair moments? It's like I think most filmmakers who've done personal documentaries have grappled with this, but you are opening up your private world for people to consume. For me, it has been sort of like a delicate balance, and it's been sort of hard to navigate the lines. Like there are times where there are emotional things, and I feel like a lot of people on the outside are like, mine this moment, where I know from coming from the cultural context that would be insensitive, right? Like that would shut off some of the trust that I have between me and my family members or the community. So it's sort of been hard to be a filmmaker wanting to get the story, but then also wanting to be considerate about the community that I'm embedded in. And it's such a small community, generations and generations of people who are related and who know one another. So for me, it's like not as easy as being in New York and just sort of like going for the story. I'm forever tied to this place and these people. So the stakes are pretty high in like going after that. And I think as far as the Can I Touch Your Hair moments, like there are moments with my family in the film, and you haven't seen it because it's still in progress, but there are moments with my family in the film where, you know, I've watched those scenes through other people's eyes and been uncomfortable with laying that bare for people who I felt like aren't, I don't want to say educated, but like just aren't worthy of the moment. And that's something that's very hard to sort of like deal with in terms of like personal filmmaking, especially Black rural communities, personal filmmaking, because people are going to see what they want to see and read what they want to read into that. But then I become more protective as a storyteller. And so that's where I am now, more protective as a storyteller.
So you're really straddling this line between, as you said, trying to tell the story, right? Having some neutrality and some distance from it, but because it is about you, it is about the people you come from, the community you come from, you can't have that neutrality and that distance. So it's it balance. Wow. This is, I mean, I could talk to you all day long, literally, because there's so much stuff that I'm thinking about that you all are saying. It's making me really think about this process of filmmaking and how, you know, there are assumptions that we often make about certain filmmakers telling certain stories, but the reality is we all have to think about these issues of accountability. They affect us in different ways, perhaps, but they're nonetheless important for us to consider. So I am going to pass, I'm just going to walk away from the panel just for a moment to field some questions. And the first one that has come through is, who are some of the other filmmakers you all see telling Southern stories that are not extractive? Molly, you want to start?
Angela Tucker, the three of you. All three of you. Angela Tucker came immediately to mind.
Jackie Olive.
Oh, yes. Who has sadly left us for Santa Cruz, California. But yes, she's still Southern.
April, you have any?
Oh my gosh, yes. Okay, so the Angela Tucker, Jackie Olive, Garrett Bradley, Keisha Ray Witherspoon, Christine Turner. I love home, like I still love Homegoing. I think it's very Southern. A newbie, I would say like Carl Harrison Jr.
Awesome.
And so many more. There are tons. I mean, we can't. They're just everywhere. You know, Dorian Emerson. You know, Chris Wilmington on Fire. Chris Everett. You know, there are many. And I don't know where you would necessarily direct people. I think that's more kind of helpful if people are interested in finding, you know, who they are. You could look at, you know, Working Films website. You can look at Southern Documentary Fund, Center for Doc Studies, film festivals that are situated in the South. Those are the ways you find those makers. But we are legion.
Yes. Two of the three Story Shift videos at storyshift.net are Southern filmmakers. One is Jackie Olive, also Alex Glustrom with Michelle Lanier.
Yeah, all very helpful. Thank you. Zandise said, and Carl. All right. Another question is, how do you reconcile with who your audience is? Do you let certain things get lost in translation for viewers who may not relate culturally to the communities on the screen? Really interesting question. Lana, you want to take that first?
I've thought a lot about that. Um, and I guess my answer to that is that as an audience member, when I go into the theater or I go into the laptop or I go into the Netflix or whatever it is, I'm trusting that the filmmaker is going to tell me a story and it's situated within a particular community. So I'm not thinking about, whether or not there are things, and yes, there, we see things all the time, and it may be oh, that's interesting. Um, if I see something about the Hasidic community in New York, I don't think, oh, well, they didn't put that in there. If it's something I want to know, I go later, I go and I find out, what exactly it is that I'm curious about. But the question, I think, is answered by whether or not I feel as though the humanity of the story has been revealed. And I think that if it has, then fine. If not, then it's still an issue as to whether or not the things that you may be curious about what to put in and what not. Hopefully, in the journey of, so the process of documentary filmmaking is one in which, and this is something that somebody else said, I think Michelle Stevenson said, where you're changed at the end of the journey. So it is a call and response. It's an ebb and a flow. So you're going through a process by which you arrive upon what is really important to put in and what not to. So if you're true to the process, then that's all you can do. And if there are, if there's a certain reaction afterwards where you feel as though something's left out, then it may be, yes, maybe it needed to be in the film. But oftentimes, if it's a good film, it's just the information and work that you need to do to find out more about a particular community.
Anybody else want to add to that?
I would like to say yes to you needing to do more work to find out about that community. Like, I think for me as a film lover, like I've loved film my whole life. I have been on the outside of narratives forever. Like I've been on the outside of narratives about my own community. Like I've always felt sort of like I'm the outsider looking in and I have to sort of figure things out and do the work. So I think sometimes with some audiences coming from places of privilege, they want to be spoon-fed everything, but I'm kind of like, I've had to work my whole life to be centered or to understand. So for me as a filmmaker, asking you to do a little bit of work to understand the context of where I'm coming from. Like I've created this thing, right? And of course I have to have the audience in mind in creating this thing. But at the same time, I'm sort of honoring the way that I talk about the South and talk about the telling of the story is that for me and my story with my family, we tell stories on the porch. There's a cadence to the way that we tell stories. There's a rhythm. It's kind of like double Dutch, like one person jumps out, another person jumps in. It's a whole collective thing. It's like a song. And you might not know that song. You might not necessarily understand the rules to that song. But if you trust it and stay in it and you have patience and you give it time, you will understand things. So it's sort of like you just have to sit with it and maybe be uncomfortable for a little bit, but you will understand after a while. And that's how I think about it and see it. And that's how I put it to people. But I think when you're a maker, you're sort of caught in between honoring the story and the rhythm and cadence of the story you're trying to tell and creating a product that people can consume comfortably.
Yeah, I think that is beautiful. And I would just like to add, even though I'm not on the panel, but as a filmmaker, I'm just thinking about, when I began to about film, which explores the and girl, had the decision very early on, who is this film for? And I was pretty clear that it was for Black women and girls. And so that meant that I'm going to tell this story in a way that's going to resonate with my audience. And if other people come along and they get something out of it, awesome. But this is not going to be a lobbying film. This is not going to be an appeal for our humanity. This is going to be me situating this subject matter in a way that makes that makes it relatable immediately, hopefully, to Black women and girls, because that's who it's for. And I think when you're very clear about who the audience is, and especially when we think about power dynamics, right? Like if I was, it would almost make sense in a white supremacist society that I make the film for white people, right? Almost like a voyeuristic, to Lana's point, a voyeuristic view into this community and this subject. But as a Black woman filmmaker, it was really important to me that I not even see that. I don't even want to think about that gaze. I want to do this for my community. And I'm pretty sure that all of you understand where I'm coming from.
Absolutely. And the importance of that is that there are stories that we haven't been able to unlock to heal ourselves. And so that's very important. And so when I have to put myself in the position of worrying about the gaze of a white person, then I rob myself of the ability to be able to heal and heal others like me, so that when I'm originally from Philadelphia. However, my father's family is from North Carolina. My mother's family is from South Carolina. And so when I came here to live, I realized that it wasn't until that moment that I understood intrinsically the conflict between my father and his father, my grandfather. And so in being on this land, being in this space, that unlocked something in me. I was working on Fish and Grits at the time. You know the project, Natalie. And they were going to a hog killing, right? And me, the vegetarian at the time, I was like, no way, Jose, I'm not going. And so they went, they shot it, came back, and I'm looking at the footage. And the footage is beautiful because it's footage of Black men who are in charge of their foodways, Black men who are also passing down the traditions of the South to, both the men and the women and the girls and the boys of their family. And so in seeing that moment, I got to understand why the conflict, my father having been raised in Philadelphia and my grandfather having been raised in North Carolina, Virginia, how in my grandfather's worldview, my father wasn't a full human being. He was less of a man because he didn't know his ways of going out and shooting game and, doing all of these things. And so what that does, it humanizes my grandfather for me. So I'm able to then heal and understand him a little bit more. So that is something that has to happen within that is situated within the Black community, and even more specifically, the Black Southern community. So that's something that you sparked when you said what you said.
Yeah. April, Molly, any additional comments in response to the comment about the audience, what I said?
I guess what it raises for me in the context of gatekeepers is what has to change is people that are not your audience being in the position of whether or not those stories get resourced or what value they have. And that's just what's not, that's unfortunate that that's not where the funding landscape is at. I think there are people in positions that are determining the value of stories that are not for them, to put it simply. And I think we just have to kind of peel back the veil on that, and it's going to need to get addressed, because the stories are just as valuable. And yeah, until we shift that who is determining that value and who's being resourced, we're going to continue to have the kind of discrepancies that exist. And BIPOC filmmakers, and in particular artists in the South, that are outside of these hubs, not being resourced in the ways that they should. So I guess, yeah, that's kind of the connection I'm drawing from what was just so excellently, beautifully shared.
April, do you have anything to add to that? And thank you for that, Molly. No? Well, I just want to, huh?
I said, I don't think so.
Okay. All right. Well, we have to close out in one moment, but I just want to lift up something for the panel to walk away with, for our attendees to walk away with, just to sort of meditate on. And that is something that someone that I think all of us know, Michelle Lanier, shared with a group of women that I'm really honored to be a part of, that gets together for a happy hour every couple of weeks. And in the work that Michelle does, she restores and preserves historic sites in North Carolina. And she told the story of going into the house of a civil rights leader, someone who was very prominent in North Carolina, but that's not known nationally, and how in the drawers of this house that is intact from who knows the last time someone lived there were pieces of aluminum foil. And she didn't say what was in it, but there was aluminum foil and bags from bread that had been bought, right? Like Wonder Bread, or some type of bread that had been bought that was Southern in brand. But what it made me think about is how the nuance of Black life, of Southern life, is so particular. Lana said earlier, you have to be specific if you're going to tell somebody's story. And the idea of aluminum foil in a drawer and what that means in the South, what that means to a Black family, what those bread bags mean. If you don't understand nuance like that, you got to get where you can understand that, no matter who you are, because a part of telling the story of the South is understanding that type of nuance. Thank you today for listening in on just an amazing conversation with these incredible women, these filmmakers, this co-director of an organization that is really striving to do the work that's going to move this type of thought around accountability and ethical storytelling forward. We really want you to keep in touch with us. And so in the chat, you will see links to April and Lana's work. You'll see a link to StoryShift, where you can look at the videos that we produced with filmmakers, as Molly said, several of whom are situated in the South. And there's also a link to that I referred to earlier, that the core values that our working group, the StoryShift, that StoryShift has been working with, a framework that we continue to try to build out, is located. And so you can reach out to us through the link, accountability, and let us know to be in touch. Can send you the grow. We hope that you will take us up on that offer to help us refine this accountability framework. Thanks again. Yeah, it's lagging. It's lagging a little bit. I'm sorry, my Wi-Fi is awful, but thanks again, and we hope to see you again very soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Everyone.
That was fun.